Okay, great. I can see folks starting to enter. So I will we'll give folks a minute to join, and I will just share a little bit of an introduction about me and the organization. So I'm Lauren from Stop Stalking Us. We're the only nonprofit in the US that is specifically focused on stalking. We'll drop this in our in the chat, but you can visit our website, stopstalkingus.com, if you need access to resources, or if you want to share your own story anonymously. We're really dedicated to supporting survivors and building community because we know stalking can be so isolating and really devastating, and there are a lot more of us out there than it might seem. This is our last event of Stalking Awareness Month. We've had some really incredible conversations, and so we'll also drop that link into the chat where you can find any that you might have missed. But it was really important for us to end this series by having a conversation about healing from trauma, especially from something like stalking, which is so prolonged in most cases. So I want to thank our guest today, Eva Usadi, who I will hand it over to Eva to talk a little bit more about your background, and if there are any questions, there's a place for the Q&A. So send those through there, and we will try to answer those at the end. But Eva, I will hand it over to you.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Lauren. So hello, everybody. Thank you for having me. My name is Eva Usadi, and I am a psychologist / social worker who I've been in practice for 35 years and in private practice for most of that time. And my initial degree in psychology is in what's called existential phenomenological psychology. It's a mouthful, but it's a very particular way of understanding humans and the conditions in which we live and grow and develop. And then I also have a social work degree attached to that, or in addition to that. I'm from New York City, and I do live and practice in New York. And I, for many years, have worked with trauma survivors, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the modalities that I practice and that I know personally from having been a client of them myself. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. And I have been working with trauma for most of my career, and including in my very early days, I worked at an agency that employed most of the people from my program in psychology were working at this and other agencies. This was in Seattle, because that's where I did some of my training. And we were one of the first agencies in the country to use the term post-traumatic stress disorder for people that survived abuse, domestic and childhood and other kinds of abuse. So that was very early work. We're talking about the 80s, that we were using that designation, not only for combat veterans, which is how it developed, but to encompass a lot of people in our community who are being harmed by others. So I work primarily with traumatized people in individual therapy, and I also run a nonprofit. We specialize in work with combat veterans and first responders who are addressing combat trauma from their service. And of course, also I work with childhood and adult survivors of childhood abuse. So this is a new group for me. I am not an expert on stalking, but I'm going to tell you what I understand about trauma, and I think that it will make sense within this community as well. So I wanted to start out by talking about, you may have heard the term that trauma lives in the body. And perhaps you've seen some of the books about trauma in the body, or, that the body doesn't lie. And these are important things to keep in mind as we talk a little bit more today about what happens when a person is traumatized. And I think one of the confusions in the field really is that we have the same word to describe an experience and also what happens to the person. So the word trauma describes something was a trauma, like an event was a trauma, and also a person has trauma. And I think that can be kind of confusing. Not all traumatic events result in trauma, which is a good thing. Some people heal without going through a traumatic episode. And I want to talk a little bit about PTSD, which is mostly what we call a trauma response, and complex PTSD. And there's something that Lauren said initially, which is really important, because the very big distinguishing factor between PTSD, which I refer to as simple, and that doesn't mean it's not important, it's just as contrasted with complex. So the big difference is that complex trauma comes from prolonged trauma, from trauma that does not have a beginning, a middle, and an end, but continues unabated for a long period of time, or any period of time that doesn't have a discrete ending. So what simple PTSD really, you're probably familiar with this idea of fight, flight. There's also freeze, which I'll talk about in a moment. But what happens is that when a person is in a situation where they cannot control the outcome, they're actually helpless to change the outcome, that's when a trauma response can occur, because we have the capacity to do things like flee. We have the capacity to fight sometimes. Fleeing is not always possible. Flight is not always possible. But when those things are not able to happen, when we can't actually get away or protect ourselves, then something happens in the nervous system, because being terrified, which is really what trauma is about in a life threat situation, creates a certain series of events within the nervous system. And it's mostly the overactivation of the system that involves the endocrine function and cortisol and adrenaline, which flood through the body. And this enables us really to keep ourselves alive. It enables us to run away, and it also enables us to fight if we have to, or if we can. And so when these systems are in play, this is how we stay alive. And fight, flight, and also freeze are really considered part of the animal defense system. And this is because we share these responses. These are autonomic nervous system responses that we share with mammals, and possibly some other members of the animal species as well, but we absolutely share these with mammals. And so that's why it's called the animal defense system. And just think about if you're walking in the woods and you come across, I used to say come across a bear, but that's not a good example, because now we know that you never run from a bear. You cannot outrun a bear. But let's just say you come across a different animal, and a mountain lion or a coyote, and you know you have to get away. And you're looking in the woods and you think, well, you know, that would be a nice tree to climb. Or, oh, well, wait a minute, that other tree has really nice branches, and well, that tree over there has flowers on it. Maybe I'll climb that. By the time your thought process has gone through that, you're attacked, your lunch, right? And so our nervous system has this amazing capacity to shut down our cognitive and executive functioning so that there's no thought involved. You go to the nearest tree, and that there's no thinking involved in that. That is our body's capacity to keep us alive. And another example would be of why there's a necessity to shut down this cognitive thinking. Another example would be if you've ever had the experience of being really cold and starting to develop hypothermia. Hypothermia happens when our extremities are starting to freeze, right? Very cold environment, we can't get warm. And what happens is, in the service of survival, the nervous system sends all the blood to the core organs that we need to stay alive. You unfortunately don't really need fingers and toes and a nose to live. And so those extremities get sacrificed in the service of survival, and all of the blood flows to the core organs, the heart and the lungs in particular, to keep you alive. It's sort of a similar process that happens with trauma when all of our activity in the nervous system is flooded to keep us alive and enable us to either get away or fight. Or if those are not possible, we go into freeze, which is actually a lot of adrenaline and cortisol while the person is immobilized and unable to move. And think of the deer in the headlights. It's the same process. That is not a calm animal. That's an animal who's actually terrified, but can't move, can't get away. And so these are sympathetic nervous system responses that help us. And the difficulty is that they don't, a lot of times, just turn off automatically. We have to help them turn off. And that is why we now, because of the advances in neuroscience, have therapies that can help turn that off, which actually all of that activation and arousal is part of what happens with the amygdala. The amygdala is the part of the brain that tells us we're in danger. It's considered the brain's smoke detector. It keeps firing, you're in danger, which is why after trauma, people have very strong responses to loud noises that are reminiscent of what happened to them, or a smell. Right, especially for survivors of interpersonal, the smells are very important. And whenever we hear a similar smell, the body goes into a response that is dangerous, right? And so all of these are part of the sympathetic nervous system. And what we also have been given, or whatever your belief system is, we also have the parasympathetic nervous system, which is the part of the nervous system that helps turn off all of the fight-flight responses and allow us to go into what's called rest and digest. It allows us time to recover so that we can no longer be in that traumatized state. And rest and digest is hugely important because it is not only a body experience, it's also when we have the capacity to digest food, we also have the capacity to digest emotions. And so being able to turn off those autonomic or sympathetic nervous system responses of fight flight enables us to recover from the experience. And what happens after trauma, especially life threat trauma, which is what simple PTSD is that the nervous system just does not re-regulate. It doesn't reset itself. And so we actually have to help it reset. We have to reteach it that you're not actually in danger right now. That person walking by you on the street might smell like your abuser, but that's actually not your abuser. And so we have to reteach the nervous system to have a different response so that there's options, right? It's not an automatic. There's some options that are available to us. And so one of the key parts of the parasympathetic nervous system that we work with in therapy, and especially in yoga, I'm also a yoga teacher, I should have mentioned that, is called the vagal nerve. The vagus nerve is the longest nerve in the body. It runs from the base of the brainstem all the way down to the pelvic area. And every single nerve in the body is connected to the vagus nerve. And so when that is not working optimally, because we've been under tremendous stress and trauma for a long period of time, the vagus nerve gets tired and it's not functioning optimally, which is why it's hard to get ourselves to rest and digest, and it's very hard to go to sleep. That's one of the key things that happens when people have trauma, is that sleep becomes disrupted. And some people in my world have suggested for a while that really post-traumatic stress disorder is not the right term, that PTSD should actually be post-traumatic sleep disorder, because that's mostly what people have, is an incapacity to quiet down because it doesn't feel safe, right? And so therefore sleep is disrupted, and then everything else starts becoming disrupted because we don't function well when we're not sleeping properly. So simple PTSD is all of these nervous system responses, usually a result of life threat trauma. And complex PTSD is all of those things: the hyperarousal, the intrusive thoughts, flashbacks, nightmares, and sometimes being very numb and not actually feeling anything, feeling very distant from other people, all of that is part of complex PT as well. However, because complex PTSD is usually the result of something that was done to a person by another person on purpose, it is a more complicated way of working that we need to have additional training to understand how to work with such a complex situation. And often it occurs because people have been exposed with prolonged duration to some level of traumatic event and experience. It doesn't stop. It's ongoing. The threat seems very real, and it is very real, and it's ongoing. People have been exposed to grotesque sights, sounds, and smells for a prolonged period of time. And people who have had multiple traumatic experiences, multiple traumas done to them by another human being, which really shifts the experience of the person, because it causes us to not trust other people and the world in general, that nothing feels safe. And the people that tend to be vulnerable to complex PTSD are those who have extended trauma histories, either childhood, sexual or physical abuse, people who've been stalked, people who have been imprisoned, people who've been tortured, people who've been trafficked, and also those at war. There are whole countries that are at war that have complex PTSD, as do combat veterans and some first responders as well. And so this paints a different picture, that when we're working with somebody who has been in a car accident, for example, that it happened, it's actually over. Even if the person is injured, they can be taken to a place of safety and they're away from the car. We can process that more easily, actually. It takes less time. So things that have a beginning, middle, and an end, including some natural disasters that are actually over, things that are ongoing, earthquakes where there are repeated tremors, people are still in a state of fear. And so that is a more complex picture. But we have some very good ways to work with simple PTSD that help the system to re-regulate, to reset itself so that people don't have to be symptomatic anymore. And that really is the goal of trauma treatment, is not only that you feel better, but that you actually are better. And so at the end of a successful course of trauma treatment, people are not symptomatic anymore. And, it's interesting because sometimes I get asked the question, especially if somebody's going to court to have to testify, if they're, a victim of a crime or an accident, and there's a lawsuit, that sometimes we have to, or we used to have to, delay treatment until after the person testified, because they don't look traumatized anymore. And that can affect their court case. And so what we've learned, and some lawyers have become very adept at this, is to videotape the person before trauma therapy, so that they have that as evidence that this is what the person was like after this happened to them. And then we don't have to delay treatment, which really seemed incredibly unfair and unjust, to make people wait sometimes years for a court case to come up so that they could be adequately treated. So, I can say a lot more about this, but I'm just wondering if there are any questions that people have right now about what I've just talked about. I'm certainly happy to do some questions in the middle. We're also going to have a Q&A at the end. So I'll just wait for a moment to see if anybody has a question that's come up.
Okay, and I'm checking here. I think you've answered everything so far, but yeah, if there are questions that come up, please do put those in the Q&A and we will get to them later on.
Okay, well, wonderful. Oh, I see one.
Oh, yeah, I'll let you take this then.
Let's see. What separates PTSD from CPTSD? So PTSD is simple. CPTSD is complex, and what separates it is that complex PTSD occurs over a long time period, or even days, but it doesn't have an ending. Like think about an experience where you fall, like maybe you fall off a ladder. Sorry, my phone rang. An experience where you fall off of something, or you fall off a bike, there's a sense, even though your body may not know that that's over, and we may have to re-regulate it and teach it, that event is actually over. That's a very different experience than somebody who has been stalked for years, or for days or weeks or months, because that's ongoing threat. The same with somebody living in a war zone, that there's really no place of safety. And so with complex PTSD, we have to help people create some safety internally, even though their environment may still not be safe. And there's ways of modifying the therapies that we use to work with both PTSD and complex PTSD. Some of the things are modified to work very specifically with people who are in an ongoing dangerous situation. And we can come back to this. I see there's another question. I'll look. So the question about the fawn response, I'm glad that this was asked, although I'm not sure you'll like my answer, because I don't agree with that terminology, actually. The way that I was trained is that there's fight, flight is sympathetic nervous system. Freeze is actually both. There's elements of both sympathetic and parasympathetic. And the parasympathetic also involves what are called submit and collapse. And that doesn't mean people submit on purpose or because they want to. It means that there's no other avenue. And so this is often what happens to people who've been in a complex trauma situation, is that there's no way to get out of it. So there's some level of compliance that happens, and that's often because of survival, that's necessary. And so somehow that's become fawn. And I think it's because it's the same letter that fight, flight, and freeze. So they developed this name fawn. And I have a problem with the name personally, because I looked it up. I did a Google search of definitions of fawn, and there's a sexual implication to fawn. When you're fawning, it's for some kind of attention that is not just neutral. And so I personally don't like the term. I understand it's really popular, but that's when people are not using active defenses like fleeing or fighting back. They're not able to use those. And so something else has to happen. And this is also where dissociation happens, which is when the mind can't process something because it's so horrific that it takes you away from that experience, and you're basically somewhere else. And it's another part of our defense system, and it keeps people sane, honestly. But it can interfere with the activities and the functions of daily living if people are really kind of offline too much during their day as they're going about their lives. So I hope that can trauma result from multiple relatively small life events? It depends on what they are. If somebody has been quote unquote accident prone and has had repeated accidents where their body has been hurt or they thought they were going to die, then absolutely. There can be multiple of those events that can result in trauma. I'm missing a lot of questions, so just give me one moment. Somebody is asking a question about recovering from a bad traumatic car crash, and then was stalked. And yes, I would say that the stalker situation probably has impacted the PTSD from the car accident and has made that maybe even bigger. The good thing is that let's just say hypothetically that you had the car accident treated with a trauma treatment that works, and that was not creating any symptoms anymore, then the stalking might have less impact. And this is the reason that we heal trauma, is because it leaves us stronger to respond to whatever comes down the pike in the future, so that we don't have to keep accumulating traumas, because then they get bigger, and actually the body just gets so tired that it lacks the natural defenses that might have been there after the first one, let's just say. So person getting help for their trauma, can use against them in court. If you have a court case, I would strongly recommend that you talk to your attorney. I don't mean you, the person who asked this, but anybody. Let's just say that you're in a car accident and you're very traumatized state where you can't sit still, you're kind of shaking and trembling, and you can't think of the words to answer questions because your mind's not working well enough because your executive functioning is still diminished. And you go to court in that state, people are going to have a lot of empathy. They're going to see how troubled and how affected you are by what happened. If you've had really good therapy, let's just say you've had EMDR and the car accident's done, you're finished with that, and you go to court, you're going to sound like I do now. And people are going to have a hard time believing that you get, that you should be compensated for what happened. And so lawyers who understand this, who understand how to work with trauma survivors, know that they need to videotape people before they go to court. And I'm sorry, before they have really successful trauma treatment, because they're going to look very different. Lauren, did you have a comment?
Yeah, I wanted to just add to that, because I think this is a distinction we have to talk about a lot of how the system should be and how it actually is. And so there's a lot of complexity, and Lenora Claire spoke about this in our session from last week, that sometimes, things like people don't have, feel like because they don't have a lawyer, they won't be able to do their case, whereas they see that sometimes not having a lawyer signals to a judge like, oh, this person needs more protection. So again, these aren't necessarily things that can be controlled, but I think having just understanding how the system works and knowing how these things can function, even though again, like it shouldn't be, it shouldn't take that, but understanding that I think is really critical to making sure that you're getting the support, and yeah, whether that's documentation that you need to be able to bring this to a judge. And so documenting everything, and certainly working with folks who are trauma informed, and that being a question you ask when you're vetting a lawyer or any support system.
Yes, thank you. Good comments. Can I go to the next question that's up?
Please, yes.
Okay, so how common is memory loss with trauma? It can be very common, although it's not necessarily memory loss. Sometimes it is, and sometimes it's dissociative experience, where what happened is not in conscious memory banks. It lives in the body often, and it may live in the emotional system, but it may not be remembered. So that can happen. And that's one of the benefits of trauma therapy, is that you can then have what's called a more consistent narrative. You remember all the parts of your life. And that is something that we talk with people about before we begin trauma treatment, is that there may be parts of what happened to you that you remember while we're doing this work that you don't remember right now. And so people need to know that can happen. It can be scary, but it's also a way of becoming integrated and whole again, instead of missing some of the things that happened to you, as bad as they may have been. And the other question was false memories, and that's a huge, it's come back again. A lot of us in the field thought that conversation was over. The false memory people were starting to accuse therapists of having actually implanted memories in people. I don't think that's possible unless somebody is being brainwashed, and that's an actual process that therapists don't know how to do. So I think that what happens is that when people recover memories that they hadn't had for a long time, that's questioned, and that's incredibly unfair, because things do pop up that were not consciously remembered. They were put aside, or they became dissociated off as a way of protecting the person, because they're just too big to be able to be addressed or even tolerated at the time. So that looks like there's one more. I think I got them all.
Yeah, I think, yeah, you've answered this already. So,
okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, and yeah, great questions. So I want to talk a little bit about the therapies that I use and know well. I'm not going to talk about all the therapies that are out there for trauma, because I'm not trained in all of them, so I'm going to share with you my experience and why I chose to be trained in these particular modalities. And it was very much because of my own personal experience with them. I'm skeptical, and if something doesn't work for me, I won't learn it to work with other people with it. So EMDR therapy is pretty much in the news now, and in part because of Prince Henry. And in part because of some other people, some famous celebrities who have come forward with the fact that they have had EMDR therapy after a trauma. Sandra Bullock comes to mind. She had a home invasion. She was home, and she went for EMDR therapy and said that it really saved her life and her way of living. And so EMDR therapy has been around for well over 30 years. I've been an EMDR therapist since 2001, so it's been quite a long time. I'm also an EMDR consultant, meaning I work with other new to EMDR therapy clinicians and help them learn how to do it better. And EMDR therapy is really based on what I was explaining earlier, that it helps people to be in a regulated state while they're going into their traumatic memories. Because what we found is that, and this is one of the reasons that talk therapy is not very effective with trauma. We know this, we've learned this the hard way, because a lot of people weren't getting better. And that's why EMDR and some of the other therapies were developed, because we knew we had to do something more than just talk about, because oftentimes talking about one's trauma actually made it bigger, made it worse. And there are people who are not able to talk about their trauma. It kind of fluctuates from either talking about it a lot and not getting better and sort of re-traumatizing oneself, or not being able to talk about it at all. And there's a specific reason for that, that when the cognitive part of the brain is taken offline in the interest of survival, that's the prefrontal cortex. One of the areas is Broca's area, which is where speech and language are. And if that's shut down and depressed and doesn't come back, then people have a really hard time talking about what happened to them. So the other piece of EMDR is that we know that we have to be regulated. And one of the ways that we help people be regulated during processing is by what's called bilateral stimulation. And so it started out as eye movement, which meant that the therapist would move their fingers in front of the client's eyes, and the client would follow the fingers with the eyes, or a pencil, or a stuffed animal. I've used that, especially with children. And it's through that process of back and forth eye movement that it actually replicates REM sleep, which is when memories are processed. And so there was something very alluring about this, that it actually seemed to work. It helped people get regulated so that then they could safely not only recall, but talk about their memories of what happened. But we've also learned that there are other forms of bilateral stimulation that are very effective. And one is audio. So there are EMDR tapes that therapists have access to. I think some are available online now, but the audio tapes have been redone in such a way that they're going right ear, left ear, right ear, left ear. So you're getting bilateral stimulation in your ears with headphones, and also tapping. There's a famous butterfly hug that Prince Harry demonstrated, which is tapping on yourself, which can be regulating. And in a way, it's soothing. It's kind of like, when we have a baby and we're rubbing them, and it can be soothing to the nervous system. Or you can tap on your thigh. And there are also little gadgets. They're called TheraTappers. They have different names, but they're little beepers, little buzzers that you hold in each hand, or you can put them on your thigh, and they go boop, 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 boop. They beep and they vibrate a little bit, and that is also soothing. So anytime you're doing bilateral stimulation, you're going to be calmer, which is why, think about going for a walk when you're in a state, right? It really helps mostly calm you down. Also sports, dancing, anything that uses both sides of the body, bilateral movement can be very calming and soothing. So, and these are things that we we don't just suggest to people, we actually teach how to get regulated before we go into any traumatic memories. That is actually part of EMDR processing, is that we resource people so that they have the capacity to be in a safer, calmer, more resourced place, meaning that they feel better within themselves. And that's very much a part of how we prepare people for a processing session. That's part of EMDR therapy. And the other modality that I can talk about, because I've also been doing this for over 20 years, is called sensory motor psychotherapy. It's a somatically based psychology, and it is different than EMDR, in that EMDR is still considered top down, which is that we work a lot with cognition, and we certainly work with what's happening in the body, what the body's response is, and what the emotional response. But it's also very much cognitively situated, similar to cognitive behavioral therapy. EMDR is a little bit more like that. But sensory motor psychotherapy is what's called a bottom-up processing model, which is that we really stick with what's happening in the body, because the body tells the story. So if somebody is in your office or in my office, and I'm talking to them and I see that a leg is jiggling and their leg is vibrating up and down, rather than ignore it, which is often what happens in talk therapy, we might see it, but we might not say anything. In sensory motor psychotherapy, we would really hang out with that, because that means something. And especially if people are having a hard time talking about what happened to them, either because it's too frightening or because they don't have the words, we can track how the body is holding that trauma. Just think about if you're in a car and you're coming up to a four-way stop sign and you can see somebody's about to run the intersection and your foot slams on the brake. Well, your foot and your leg holds the story of what happened to you. And so often in sensory motor psychotherapy processing, that foot and maybe the leg might start to actually have what are called micro movements. It might start trembling or vibrating or pulsing, because it's actually holding the thing that you couldn't stop from happening. It's located in that part of your body. And so we use all of this as information. It's not to stare at people or scrutinize. It's really a way of exploring. Like if my heart is beating really fast when I'm telling this story, well, let's just kind of pay attention to that. Let's not gloss over it or ignore it. And what happens is that with simple PTSD, focusing only on the body enables people to be able to move through that story without the emotion and the thought getting involved, because that often takes people out of what we call the window of tolerance, which is a place that it's safe to process. When people are too high, when they're out of their window of tolerance on the high end, they're actually in hyperarousal. When they're out of the window of tolerance on the low end, they're in hypoarousal. And neither of those two states enable sensory motor processing or EMDR therapy to really occur. We have to keep people activated enough, but not too much. And with complex PTSD, we have a very advanced way of working with sensory motor psychotherapy, where the body is important. Body is always important, but we're not just sequencing or processing what's happening in the body's telling of the story. We're also working with the emotion and the belief system that developed after that trauma, which is often globally negative and it's inflammatory about the self. So we end up with global things of, I'm not capable of protecting myself, I'm not safe, I can't get over this. The belief system is also involved in EMDR processing, but with sensory motor psychotherapy, there's a lot of focus on that during the processing, especially with complex trauma. So, and again, with sensory motor psychotherapy, we do a lot of resourcing, meaning that if a person is feeling tense in a part of the body, like let's say the hand is in a fist because they're really angry and the tension is being held in that fist. In order to resource, we might look for a part of the body that's not holding tension. Wow, so your fist is really tight and you're ready to punch. That was the thing you couldn't do to the person who was following you or attacking you. You couldn't fight back. Let's find a part of your body that's more settled, and let's pay attention to that as well. So it's another way of regulating what's going on in the nervous system. And so I think there might be a question, because I want to stop with enough time to answer more questions, but also if you would like me to show you a little bit of grounding, what that can actually looks like, what, you know, resourcing through grounding, what that looks like, I'm happy to do that. And you can follow along or just listen. Have I heard of brain spotting? Yes. I took a 2-day brain spotting course, and I've never used it with anybody. It didn't work for me. I had it as a client, didn't do anything. I have colleagues who swear by it. They think that it's really phenomenal. And again, and I should have said this earlier, that for some people, EMDR is it. It works for them. For some people, sensory motor psychotherapy is it. For some people, you know, working with a yoga therapist or a yoga teacher can be the most helpful thing. Some people like brain spotting. So it's very individual. I can't say it's worthless. For some people, it is very worthwhile, but it didn't work for me. So I don't practice it. Somebody's experience with EMDR was expensive and unhelpful. Is it not so effective for CPTSD, or did I just not have a good therapist? That's a great question, and I don't know. I mean, you know, I certainly work with people who have had not good experiences with other therapists, and sometimes that's a factor. EMDR is effective with complex PTSD as long as somebody knows how to use it for complex PTSD. And so I really can't say, but I would hope that whoever asked that question don't give up. You know, it might be worth seeing an EMDR therapist who you can tell when you look in what they've said about themselves, either on Psychology Today or at the EMDR IA website, where you can find a therapist. Make sure that they say they work with complex PTSD, because we understand a lot more about it. And I know that, you know, every year I usually go to the EMDR International Association conference. Last year I presented a 3-hour session. And those of us who continue to retrain are better equipped to address the more complex situations that people have. But sometimes it's also just not a good fit. And what I tell people who are like, you know, interviewing me, if they want to come see me as a therapist, is see me once or twice, see a couple of other people, and then decide who you feel most comfortable with. Because at the end of the day, I learned this way long ago in my psychology education. At the end of the day, it doesn't so much matter what the person, what they're skilled in a way. It matters who they are and that you can connect to them. And I think most people will know that pretty soon. If you're not in the right place for you, then leave before you either waste your time or waste your money. So if there are
Eva, maybe I'll jump in there as well, because the person had mentioned it being expensive, and I know this is something we had talked about, that these therapies are something that for people who do have insurance, which obviously is not many Americans, unfortunately, but that it is something that should be covered by most insurances.
Well, that's because EMDR and sensory motor, there's no code for them. They're just psychotherapy. So any insurance that people have a psychotherapy or behavioral health coverage, this will be covered. To what extent, that's up to the individual insurance company, but we don't code, we don't write, I'm conducting EMDR sessions. It's just put down as psychotherapy. Although I will say that years ago, I don't know if this is still true, but there was a period in which Aetna would only refer traumatized clients to an EMDR therapist because they understood that it was really effective. And it's good for the insurance companies because it means you don't have to be in therapy forever. That's the other benefit of working with somebody who really understands how to process trauma.
And do you have any other, to go back to sort of the question about finding a practitioner, and obviously it's hard and each thing is individual, but there's a part of this process that I would imagine there's different levels of discomfort. Like one is just meeting a new person for the first time, especially if you're feeling in a really vulnerable state, the discomfort of trying something new, and then sort of like the discomfort of maybe not being matched with the right person. And do you have any sort of like barometer or something that you've been able to tell if something isn't the right fit, or like what signs might be that it might not be the right fit, or questions that people can be asking?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Lauren. Thank you. I think listen to your gut. People usually know in some part of them that they're not in the right place. It's the same way that when you're in danger. It's like it's your breath catching, or your heart's going too fast, or you're feeling really tight in your gut, or you just get a icky, yucky feeling. And it's like, you need to listen to that because it means something. Sometimes it means that you're just getting into a scary place. It may not be the other person, but it might be. And I would say if that happens more than once, you either need to tell that therapist this is what's going on and see how they handle it, right? Or get out. I'm sorry, but I don't think people should waste their time if they're not feeling safe. And somebody asked a question about traumatic brain injury and EMDR. So the jury's not out on this. I know that some people think it doesn't matter, but traumatic brain injury is actually an injury to a different part of the brain. And so I would think that cognitive therapy is really important for traumatic brain injury if there are cognitive functioning problems. And if you're going to do EMDR, my rule of thumb is I would never do eye movement with somebody with a traumatic brain injury. I would do somatic, like tapping. I don't even know about audio. I don't have an audio system anymore. So I mostly do tapping because I'm working a lot with people remotely. And so tapping is really safe, and it's not going to cause the same kind of, sometimes with traumatic brain injury, people have eye problems. And so that's just too much visual stimulation. So I would say find a therapist who understands this. And usually we give people options. I have clients who prefer eye movement, some prefer tapping, some used to prefer audio, and it's whatever is most comfortable. But I would say that there is reason to use some caution. I just think this from what I've read, and I work with a lot of combat soldiers who have traumatic brain injury, and I don't do eye movement with them. I do other forms of bilateral stimulation. So I had a little slide that I made that I can share screen and show with the contact information, or I can send it to Lauren and she can send it to you all as a PDF. Either is completely fine with me.
Yeah, if you want to share it here, if that's easy, if it works, we'll see if the Zoom gods are feeling it today. Awesome. And
okay.
then we can also send this out separately.
Right. And I didn't talk about somatic experiencing, mostly because I'm not trained in it. I had it as an individual. It didn't work as well for me. I think sensory motor psychotherapy is a much more advanced model, but somatic experiencing is pretty popular, and there's not a reason to not try it if you want to. But these are the three, in my opinion, and again, I'm just giving you my opinion, these are three major places to go to find a trauma therapist who really is going to know how to work with you. And so I would recommend that. And then the next thing is just me, my contact information, if you want to send me a note or learn a little bit more about these modalities. And so, yeah, I can make sure that Stop Stalking Us has access to those little slides.
Great. And yeah, I guess if there's any final questions, now's the time to drop those in. And I guess one question I have is just understanding, because I think it's interesting. You also had mentioned that you do yoga as well, and how that sort of can either complement or yeah, just if there's specific types of yoga or specific types of practitioners that people should be looking for, if that's something they want to explore.
That's a really good question. Thank you, Lauren. I should have added that to my resource list. But yes, there is something now called trauma-informed yoga, and that's the kind of teacher that you want to look for, who really understands how to work with, in particular, people who've been personally victimized. And so there is yoga teacher, which I am. I am not a yoga therapist. That is a special designation, and that is people who often do work very closely with a therapist. So one of my yoga teachers that I'm really close to, and we do a lot of work together, she gets referrals from therapists in her community. She is trained in yoga therapy, and she works closely with the therapist on what is going on and how she can kind of, either open up the heart or get people breathing better, open up the hips, which is a place that people, especially if anybody's been sexually assaulted, keeps a lot of tension in their pelvic area, a lot of lack of flexibility, and that can actually tighten up the whole inside of the body. And so there are very specific practices that people who are properly trained, do with people. But I think that trauma-informed yoga, I'm sure that is easily Googleable. Call Dr. Google and find a trauma-informed yoga teacher, because they, that training is very specific. Just an example would be if you've been to a yoga class and the yoga teacher came over to adjust a pose and touched you and don't touch me, or maybe didn't feel comfortable saying that. Trauma-informed yoga is very sensitive to issues like that, of, making sure that you have permission to touch, and that you're asking permission of somebody who is comfortable saying no if they don't want to be touched. And most of us aren't. And so generally now there's kind of like, don't touch unless you actually know the person. So there's some very specific little things, not little, important things that have been added to the teaching of yoga teachers who are going to be working with traumatized people, which frankly is most of us, right?
Thank you so much for laying that out. And yeah, this has been so helpful, and I hope has been a good sort of primer or starting point. I know some folks have tried this, and I would suggest for people looking to continue to find the thing that works for them. I think it's hard to imagine starting to heal from something that is ongoing. But hopefully finding some of those resources to feel a little bit more in control of that. So really appreciate your time and thought here.
Yeah. I appreciate that. And I wanted to say one more thing in response to that, Lauren. I see there's two questions, but I think that what happens after trauma is that we lose our capacity to trust, because nothing feels safe. And properly trained trauma therapists and people that know how to do this really appreciate and honor that. And so it's a process of helping the client learn to trust again. It's not something that's going to happen in the first session or the second or third. That's different than a gut feeling that you're in the wrong place.
Right. And one of the questions, it looks like it was just putting the resource page back up. So maybe what we can do is wrap out the session and just leave these up for folks if they want to get it, and we will also be sure to send all of this information out. And also just to make sure everyone saw in the chat, we dropped links to our other 3 talks that we've done this month. One about stalking research, one about journalism and public figures, conversation with Lily Baldwin and Lenora Claire. And we will be adding this as well to that probably early next week, if you want to revisit it, or if you know somebody who might benefit from these. But Eva, thank you again so much for joining us and for the work you do.
No, you're very welcome. It's been a pleasure, and everybody who said thank you, you're very welcome. And it's been my pleasure. And I hope everybody gets what they need, and even if it takes a little bit of searching.
All right. Thanks so much. Take care.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.